Everyone, today we will discuss about the midbrain. The objectives are to learn about the midbrain, its relations, external features, internal features, blood supply and the clinical anatomy. The midbrain is the mesencephalon of the central nervous system. It is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep, wake, arousal and temperature regulation. In the previous class we have learned that the forebrain includes two cerebral hemisphere and two lateral cavity or the lateral ventricle, the thalamus, hypothalamus and the third ventricle. The hindbrain includes the pons, medulla oblongata, the cerebellum and the fourth ventricle. The midbrain connects the forebrain with the hindbrain and the central cavity of the midbrain is known as aqueduct. So, that aqueduct connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. So, the midbrain is nothing but the mesencephalon. It measures about 2 centimeter long. It connects the hindbrain with forebrain. The cavity of the midbrain, that is cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, it connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. So, in this picture you can make out the aqueduct connecting the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle, which is present adjacent to the cerebellum. Cerebral aqueduct, it is 1.8 centimeter long. It traverses the midbrain. It is surrounded by a layer of grey matter called the central or periaqueductal grey. There is no choroid plexus in this aqueduct and it transmits the CSF from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Relations of the midbrain: anteriorly it is related to the interpeduncular structures. Posteriorly it is related to the splenium of corpus callosum, great cerebral vein, the pineal body and the posterior ends of the right and left thalamus. On each side it is related to parahippocampal gyrus, the optic tracts, posterior cerebral artery, the basal vein, trochlear nerve, the geniculate bodies. So, coming to the ventral surface, the ventral surface is related to the crus cerebri. It is crossed by the optic tract, the basal vein, the posterior cerebral and superior cerebellar artery. The oculomotor nerve emerges from the medial aspect and the trochlear nerve emerges from the lateral aspect. The dorsal surface, it is related to the superior colliculi, which is connected to the lateral geniculate body by the superior brachium, and the inferior colliculi, that is connected to the medial geniculate body by the inferior brachium. So, the superior colliculi is connected to the lateral geniculate body, whereas the inferior colliculi is connected to the medial geniculate body. So, coming to the subdivisions of the midbrain. So, midbrain can be divided into tectum and the cerebral peduncle. The tectum includes the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. The cerebral peduncle have three parts, that is crus cerebri, substantia nigra and the tegmentum. So, the tectum, it includes the right and left superior colliculi and the right and left inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi, the brachium, that is the superior brachium, extends from the superior colliculus. It passes between the pulvinar and the medial geniculate body. It is partly continued into the lateral geniculate body of the optic tract. So, the superior colliculi mainly concerned with the medial geniculate body, but partly it continued into the lateral geniculate body and the optic tract. The inferior colliculi, it is the principal midbrain nucleus of the auditory pathway. The inferior brachium passed to the medial geniculate body. Now the cerebral peduncle. So the cerebral peduncle is having three parts: the crus cerebri, substantia nigra and the tegmentum. So here we can see the crus cerebri, the substantia nigra which is dark in color, and the tegmentum part of the second part. So here the cross section we can see the crus cerebri, the substantia nigra and the tegmentum. So above the aqueduct, centrally in the median plane we can see a circular structure, that is the cerebral aqueduct. Above that is the tectum. So here you can see the subdivisions, and we can represent diagrammatically like this. The tectum and the tegmentum can be separated by the imaginary line that is passing through the center of the cerebral aqueduct. So the internal features can be studied at two levels, that is at the level of inferior colliculi and at the level of superior colliculi. So first we will learn about the transverse section at the level of inferior colliculi. Again we can divide it into the grey matter and the white matter. The grey matter, the central or the periaqueductal grey matter contains the nucleus of the trochlear nerve in the ventromedial part and the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve in the lateral part. So the mesencephalic nucleus is made up of unipolar cells and receives the proprioceptive impulses from the nucleus muscles of the mastication, the facial, the ocular muscles and the teeth. And the inferior colliculus receives the afferents from the lateral lemniscus and gives the efferents to the medial geniculate body. The substantia nigra, it is a lamina of grey matter. Here we can observe the grey color structure. So it is like a lamina or the lamina of the grey matter made up of deeply pigmented nerve cells. It is concerned with the muscle tone. So now the inferior colliculi, the white matter. What are the white matter contains? So the crus cerebri contains the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers of pyramidal tract at the middle 2/3, the frontopontine fibers in the medial 1/6 and the temporopontine, the parietopontine and the occipitopontine fibers in the lateral 1/6. The tegmentum contains the ascending tracts. So in the form of a lemnisci. From medial to lateral, it includes the medial lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, spinal lemniscus and the lateral lemniscus. So they are arranged like a band, giving the appearance of a necklace. Then the decussation of the superior cerebellar peduncle is seen in the median plane. And the medial longitudinal bundle lies in close relation to the trochlear nucleus. The tectospinal tract and the rubrospinal tract is also present, so which is represented by T and the R. Then the trochlear nerve also passes laterally and dorsally around the central grey matter. It decussates in the superior medullary velum and emerges lateral to the frenulum veli. Now the transverse section of the midbrain at the level of superior colliculi. So the grey matter includes the central grey matter contains the nucleus of the oculomotor nerve, including the Edinger-Westphal nucleus in the ventromedial part. And the superior colliculus receives the afferents from the retina and the various other centers. It gives the efferents to the spinal cord, that is the tectospinal tract. It controls the reflex movements of the eyes and of the head and neck in response to visual stimuli. The pretectal nucleus lies deep to the superolateral part of superior colliculus. It receives the afferents from the lateral roots of the optic tract. It gives efferents to the Edinger-Westphal nuclei of both sides. The red nucleus is about 0.5 cm in diameter. It receives the afferents from the superior cerebellar peduncle, the globus pallidus, the subthalamic nucleus and the cerebral cortex, and it gives the efferents to the spinal cord, the reticular formation, the thalamus, the olivary nucleus, the subthalamic nucleus, and it has an inhibitory influence on the muscle tone. So, here also the substantia nigra you can observe, and the mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve we can see in the lateral part of the central grey matter. So, the white matter at this level, the crus cerebri has the same tracts as we have seen, that is the corticospinal tract in the middle, frontopontine fibers in the medial 1/6 and the temporopontine, parietopontine and the occipitopontine fibers in the lateral 1/6. So, the tegmentum contains the medial lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus and the spinal lemniscus. Here the lateral lemniscus is absent because it is terminated in the inferior colliculus. The decussation of the tectospinal and the tectobulbar tracts forms the dorsal tegmental decussation, that is also called as the decussation of Maynard, and the decussation of the rubrospinal tracts forms the ventral tegmental decussation. Then we can see the medial longitudinal bundle or the fasciculus, and there is a emerging fibers of oculomotor nerve. The tectum shows the posterior commissure connecting the two superior colliculi. So, to summarize the transverse section at the level of the inferior colliculi, the cavity is known as the cerebral aqueduct. The nuclei includes the inferior colliculus, substantia nigra, trochlear nucleus, mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. The motor tracts includes corticospinal and corticonuclear tracts, temporopontine fibers, frontopontine fibers, medial longitudinal fasciculus. The sensory tracts includes the medial lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, spinal lemniscus, the lateral lemniscus and the superior cerebellar peduncles. So, all these structures we can observe at the level of the inferior colliculi. And at the level of the superior colliculi, again the cavity is the cerebral aqueduct. The nuclei includes the superior colliculus, substantia nigra, pretectal nucleus, oculomotor nucleus, mesencephalic nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the red nucleus. The motor tracts includes the corticospinal and corticonuclear tracts, temporopontine fibers, frontopontine fibers, the medial longitudinal fasciculus and the rubrospinal tract. The sensory tracts includes the medial lemniscus, trigeminal lemniscus, the spinal lemniscus. So, now the blood supply. The arterial supply is by the posterior cerebral artery, superior cerebellar artery and the basilar arteries. So, the venous drainage is through basal or greater cerebral veins. So, here we can observe the blood vessels in another view showing the posterior cerebral artery, superior cerebellar artery and the basilar artery. Clinical aspect: Weber's syndrome. It involves the third cranial nerve nucleus and the corticospinal fibers. The features are: there will be involvement of corticospinal fibers gives rise to the hemiplegia on the opposite side. The paralysis of third nerve gives rise to the pupil points downwards. The Benedict's syndrome, here the tegmentum of the midbrain is damaged. So, there will be loss of medial lemniscus, red nucleus, the superior cerebellar peduncle, the fibers of third cranial nerve. So, the features in the Benedict's syndrome includes because of the lesion of medial lemniscus, there will be loss of proprioception. Due to the injury to the third cranial nerve, there will be pupil points downwards and laterally. Damage to the red nucleus and superior cerebellar peduncle gives rise to tremors and twitching of the opposite side. Perinaud's syndrome. The lesion of the superior colliculi gives rise to this Perinaud's syndrome. There will be weakness of the upward gaze, the vertical nystagmus. So, in this diagram we can observe the area affected by the different syndromes. So, here we can see the area involved in the Weber's syndrome, that is the crus cerebri part in the substantia nigra. In the Benedict's syndrome, the tegmentum part is involved, and in the Perinaud's syndrome the tectum part is involved, that is the superior cerebellar peduncle. Argyll-Robertson pupil, here the light reflexes is lost, the accommodation reflex is retained due to lesion in the vicinity of the pretectal nucleus. So, now the questions for the assignment. Usually the transverse sections at the different levels they will ask. So, here the diagram is very important. The transverse section of the midbrain at the level of inferior colliculus, transverse section of the midbrain at the level of superior colliculus, the Weber's syndrome and Benedict's syndrome. Thank you.